Hello, and welcome to Testing 123, bite-sized chunks of wisdom brought to you by Sogeti, leaders in testing. In our very first episode, we discussed about testing in a distributed way, and we saw how the agile mindset can support you in your efforts. While governments these days are communicating their plans to reboot the economy, it's probably also a very good time to start thinking about how you will restart your testing activities. But do you know what you're in for? And how do you construct a sound approach for this? Let's follow Daniel Maslyn as he walks us through some important considerations for companies that want to get a head start in the quality game.
Okay, thanks Paul for that introduction. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Maslyn. I'm a senior test consultant here at Sogeti, and I'd like to talk to you today about something we're all facing, which is how we want to get our teams restarted. So I'm talking here about a controlled testing restart. Now in my last vlog, what I was talking here is about keeping the momentum in this time of distributed working, some practical considerations. And one of the things that I mentioned in there was the new normal. And with that, I'd like to talk more about that today. Of course, it's a challenging context, a challenging time. We see some shifts from working from home to restoring that distributed working, harnessing the power of the team in a more virtual way. But today I'd really like to focus about how we're going to relaunch and return when this is over, and some things you might want to consider. This was mentioned as another vlog in the future, and that's this vlog. So let's look at the idea of a change curve as a starting point, where productivity on one axis and time on the other. Of course, this curve will vary depending on your readiness, your quality vision, your direction, your speed, and where you were at the beginning. Let's look at this kind of a curve as a classic, right? Where your initial situation was quite more productive than, let's say, a situation after the impact of working, having to work remotely and disbanding teams, etc. The idea is to get back to normal and to move to a new normal, aiming for more improvements. Along the way, you might think of this as the old way of testing and this the new way of testing, and this requires an understanding of where you were at, what the impact was, exploring new ways, and moving on with the team in a phased approach. And that's what this is about, working in a phased approach. So let's say that this was the impact, that people were working remotely, that your efficiency was a little bit less. The question is, how do we move from getting this team together to even a new normal? How do we achieve that? So I've put together, I think, some basic steps here, not a process, not even a model, just some basic steps. You might want to interchange or take the steps in different directions or to greater lengths. Be interested to hear from you. But the idea is to approach it, assess where you're at, prioritize, define some actions, and of course, measure and move on to a new normal. This needs to be looked on as kind of a change approach, so that requires communication, motivations, and working with value as a driver, and doing this in an iterative way. So let's understand that this is also, applicable to you depending on your situation, whether or not you're DevOps or more of an agile framework or SAFe or waterfall model or V model. Think of this as some considerations. So it's a guide, not a process. Of course, your first step is looking at the approach. What we mean by this is that it needs to be a bit customized. Depending on the context you're at, in any case, your team members are going to have to be able to move progressively towards getting back up to full speed, not going just from one working and big bang into the office without some kind of forethought on that. That's the message. And I think that depends on the team that you are working with, your context, its readiness, the maturity of the team, all kinds of factors. But that will help to determine the uniqueness of your approach. I think to keep in mind it's iterative and to understand that there's a few approaches. I just mentioned a few here, but one thing to keep in mind, it's not about speed necessarily. It's not the quickest teams or the quickest movements that win the race. So here's three to consider. Of course, I'd be interested in hearing yours. Maybe there's some things that I don't mention here, of course, and doing it in the shortness of this presentation, but you basically have this idea. You're either going to go for a full reboot. This might be good for resilient agile teams that don't need this kind of a phased approach. They can bring this into the sprint backlog grooming and approach it as part of a retrospective. You might be a hybrid team, stabilizing, but needing a little bit more of a refined approach so they can get some ideas from this. That's a graduated approach. Or you might be a team that's really uncertain right now, working in a sequential way, and you might need a more phased approach, very progressive, and understanding the constraints you're facing. Either way, once you do that, and of course, steps 2 and 3 here, you can interchange them. Do you prioritize first and then assess, or do you assess and prioritize and define? It's interchangeable. But for assessing, one thing you definitely need to look at is a model, I think. And in this case, I used the TPI next, and I'm going to go back to that here in this talk because I think one interesting part is I talked last time more about key areas and checkpoints, but I want to talk about the enablers because I think that's important for this consideration of returning. Risks will never remain the same. Risks have changed. Things have changed. Business climate has changed. And your people are reskilled. They need to maybe be sharing some skills. There needs to be other adjustments to your regression approach. All kinds of defects might have been reported in the time they need to be handled when you get back. There's all kinds of really innumerable enablers. This is a kind of uncharted territory you're going to have to consider, and then you're going to have to prioritize. Here, prioritizing based on value. And again, with this, I'm going back to the voice model. A voice model, value, objectives, indicators, confidence, and experience all add up. Something mentioned in our Quality for DevOps team's book that just came out from our colleagues. So that would be a nice topic for another vlog, as I mentioned. So that's something to bring up with our host, Paul, for a possible session in some way. The scope of IT delivery here, testing is not in a vacuum, and we measure our indicators, our testing indicators, to help give some confidence in that pursued value. So that's a quick way of looking at it. Basically, if we take that value model and we kind of put it in a kind of prioritization matrix where value is the axis and effort, then you get a kind of classic Eisenhower matrix or an action item list matrix where, of course, things with a high value and little effort become your upper left quadrant to do now. Maybe this is going to be helpful to do this exercise when you get back, or do later things that have a good value but require too much effort, etc., with the do nexts, with a kind of lesser value but less effort. And things that require a lot of effort but don't have a lot of value, you might want to consider dropping. Focusing on some basics here in this step is that you need to just think about your strategy for testing, essentially, and how you're going to bring that team together and the criteria. That value will be one of the key drivers. Defining some actions is very related. Basically, some things to keep here and focus on the basics. Each of those actions that you plan should be linked with what are the values that you've decided upon. And those improvements would ideally have a metric, we'll talk about that later here, as evidence of how to measure it, how to keep moving. Of course, Scrum, Agile, and other developments are based on an empirical attitude, and everyone in the team and testing needs to understand where we're at. So that would be an interesting action item to let everyone know where they're at, as well as to run an intake test, do some exploratory testing, understand your regression and retest versus regression testing. But one of the main things I think would be a basic action item you need to get back to is feedback from those stakeholders. Get reconnected to the stakeholders. And good way to do this is a product risk assessment, or reassessing the risk that will give a feedback to how you want to change your strategy with the other stakeholders. So sales, business, data center, everyone, the project managements, the product owners as it may be. Get in touch with them and understand what things have changed. And then look to your technical people, the infra, the developers, design, etc., and understand where they think defects are going to be occurring now based on the new changes with that chance of defects. This will give you a good way to identify your risk and update your test strategy. Your test strategy will be adjusted based on that, and you may be looking at new test types, new test techniques to be used for different kinds of object parts or characteristics that you were going for previously. Things will change. So embracing that change is part of it. And measuring that change and showing progress is important as well. So in the previous vlog too, I mentioned you want to pick metrics that matter. And one good technique, you see there the initials GQM in the upper right, that's goal, question, metric. The idea there is that you have a goal in mind, you have questions that a metric is going to answer. Important goals, important questions, obviously based on your prioritizations on the value model, the voice model, and then going for the metrics that set information and visualize that for your stakeholders. So, of course, after you've done the approach, assess, prioritize, define, and measure, you're going to be reaching a new normal. What do we mean by this? It's not that things were abnormal before per se, but you want to be reaching this new normal in a cyclic way and move on from it to improve and to optimize. And not all of the people in your team are going to have that same kind of optimizations or productivity velocity at the same time. They're going to come back in different rhythms in different ways. As mentioned in the change curve, it's going to vary. But the bottom line, again, to keep in mind is the old way of testing is not going to be like the new way of testing. That's for sure. That's one thing. This is uncharted territory. But the good thing is it opens up new possibilities for your team to move forward. So you need to follow up on those inputs, provide that understanding and encouragement to move forward. Because past the new normal, you need to keep moving. And I think that's basically what I want to get across mainly. It's just a step-by-step process. So if those steps can help you to get an idea of how you're going to communicate, how you're going to take your business context, how you're going to look at an action plan and measure that to your new normal, then you really want to focus on controlling the restart. So look for opportunities, look for that, get feedback from your stakeholders. And speaking of which, we're there also to help navigate at that time, to that new normal and beyond. And this idea, for example, these vlogs are helping to get ideas to you about how you want to consider that structured restart of your testing. Maybe this is a time to use aspects of a TPI Next assessment which you offer, which could give you ideas into how improvements can move forward and give you a good basis for assessing your organization and come up with some new improvements, or moving it forward to your test automation, making it more intelligent. And as mentioned, optimizations. Some of the items that have occurred in this distribution period, there have been new discoveries for your team in which this distributed way of working could be brought back on site to help different workforce models. And an augmented workforce could be done. Interesting about that is we have another subject called the test factory, which I said, which really leans itself well to that kind of way of working. There's other solutions too. So do reach out and give us a contact, and we'd be happy to contact back. So some references on this talk today: the voice model, of course, also TMAP Next, TPI Next, which are our constant process models, the World Quality Report, which we have out, and that Quality for DevOps Teams book. Of course, there's also other references I could have mentioned. Those are all at the ictbooks.com there, Sogeti and Testing. So please go check some of those out. Well, that's it for me for today. And this was getting up to speed. I really wish you lots of luck in your controlled testing restart your team. I hope this gave you some ideas today. And that's it for me today. I'd like to pass it over back to Paul, our host.
Are you ready to reboot those testing activities in the new normal, better, faster, and stronger than ever before? Well, we certainly hope so. By the way, if you want to learn more about the publication that Daniel mentioned, the TMAP publication, Quality for DevOps Teams, including the voice model, well, then I have a very special announcement for you today. On May 13th, 4 p.m. CET, we will be running a live webinar with the author of the book. So he will do a presentation and you will have all the time in the world to ask your questions to him directly. So if you want to join us, I will put a link in the description here below, or you can just head over to our homepage, sogeti.be, and head over to the events section where you will find the registration form. That's it for today. I hope to see you next time for our next episode of Testing 123. Stay healthy and keep on testing.